There is a common belief that time helps criminals. The longer it passes, the fewer traces remain. A month or two, and witnesses start to forget important details. Snow and rain wash away the bloody footprints on the ground, and hands that just yesterday were trembling with fear or anger calm down, helping to hide the truth forever. Today's case began more than 30 years ago, but it was only concluded in 2025. Russia, Vladivostok, June 1994. One ordinary summer day, an entire family disappeared without a trace from their apartment. The husband, his pregnant wife, and their 3 children. The neighbors didn't notice how it happened. Too many disturbing things were happening around at that time, and sometimes it was too dangerous to see or hear what was going on behind the closed doors of apartments. No bodies were found, there were no witnesses, and the relatives only realized something was wrong almost a year later. It seems obvious from the very beginning that the criminals will never be found. And yet, almost 3 decades later, the guilty ended up on trial. The story they told was shocking in its cynicism and cruelty. Their names were Sergei Smail and Valery Markov. Both were supposedly natives of Vladivostok. Both were about the same age, born in 1967 and 1968. There is almost no information in the sources about their childhood and education, nor are there any details about the families they grew up in. The only thing known is that they met in the army and served together in Kamchatka. At that time, Valery Markov had the nickname Kek. Its origin is unknown, but it would still play a role later. After being discharged in 1990, Smagin and Markov returned to Vladivostok and continued their friendship. The guys were business-minded, sharp, quick-witted, typical youth of the early 1990s, ready to use any opportunity to make money. When the USSR collapsed like many others, they grabbed at anything that came their way. They looked for jobs, did odd work, tried to start a business, tried to make money. And back then, business often went hand in hand with crime. Smagin and Markov were not involved in criminal organizations, at least there is no information about that. But like many others, they wanted to make some extra money and understood that if they acted carefully, they could avoid responsibility even for a serious crime. This understanding became the first timid step toward that fateful day in 1994. Perhaps the future criminals didn't realize back then how far they would go in their thirst for profit. But maybe even then, feeling they had each other's support, they realized that if necessary, they would go all the way. Sergei Smagin lived in an apartment building on Nikiforov Street. The guy's neighbors were the Tartsev family, a couple with 3 small children. The oldest was 5, in some sources 7, the middle one was 2, and the youngest was just 1 year old. The head of the family was 28 years old. 18-year-old Pavel was sociable, and Smagin himself was not known to be quiet either. The men greeted each other when they met in the stairwell or on the street and bummed cigarettes from each other. It just happened naturally that they started talking, and during one of these smoke breaks together, Pavel mentioned that they wanted to move out of Vladivostok. "My wife doesn't work, she stays home with the kids, and once again our salaries have been delayed for 3 months, the man complained. We're here alone in the city, no relatives, no friends. It would be better to move closer to family, at least we'd have some help." Smagin nodded sympathetically. The situation was common. With the widespread closure of businesses, many people were left without jobs, and even those who kept working lived poorly. Wage arrears were growing, management promised to pay someday, but urged people to keep working and not to quit. Pavel didn't mind working and not quitting, but he was against working for free. "We would sell the apartment and leave," Pavel sighed. "But who would buy it? I don't know anyone I could offer it to. No one has any money." Smagin sensed an opportunity almost immediately, like a quiet business idea that comes up and just won't let go. Alatartsev's words stuck firmly in his mind, "And we don't have any relatives or friends here. We're alone in the city." Alone. That meant fewer witnesses, fewer questions. Alone. That meant no one would be able to help. Smagin was already thinking like a criminal, although it's quite possible that he didn't realize it at first. And then he acted as his instincts told him. Carefully but confidently he began to gain their trust. A cigarette with Pavel today, holding the door for his wife tomorrow, candy for the kids, and compliments to the proud parents a couple of days later. Simple, everyday politeness, little things that wove together into the real spiderweb of the crime to come. Smagin gave the impression of someone who not only wanted to help, but really could. He was, as they say, in the know, assured that he knew all the pitfalls, understood the market, and warned against scammers who were everywhere. In those years, the word realtor wasn't as common, and real estate deals were often arranged through acquaintances and their acquaintances. And Smagin once mentioned to Pavel that he knew such a person. Carefully, without hinting at anything or mentioning any names. "We served together. I've known him for a long time," he continued, noticing that Alatarchev was interested. His acquaintance apparently wanted to buy a place to live. Markov himself, when his friend told him about his idea, didn't hesitate for a moment. "Good job, Seryoga. You figured it out quickly. There's a person who's interested. Just make sure you don't let them slip off the hook. Tell them that your acquaintance is serious about it. Suggest a meeting. We don't want them to find someone else, and I'll find the right person. We'll get everything done quickly." Smagin did exactly that at the next meeting. A look of genuine relief flashed across Pavel's face. Finally they would be able to break free and leave. He shook Smagin's hand for a long time and promised to thank him properly. "Come by, we'll set the table, we'll sit together. If everything works out, I'll never forget you, Seryoga." Smagin, wasting no time, introduced them to Markov, and as promised, he quickly found a front man to sign the contract. No more specific information about this person could be found. Soon, the men came over to discuss the deal. A bottle of vodka on the table, stewed meat, children's laughter from the next room, everything was simple and homey. Markov gave the impression of a modest, quiet guy. He even behaved shyly. "Seryoga is a great guy. We've known each other since the army," he remarked in the middle of the conversation. "Don't worry, we'll get everything done quickly." And the Latartsevs didn't suspect anything. Seryoga is a good guy, they agreed easily. Seryoga can be trusted, he wouldn't deceive anyone. As for Smagin, he mostly kept quiet and maintained the atmosphere. Nothing more was expected from him. He was the link, the guarantor that everything would be above board. His presence alone was enough for the Latartsev family. At the end of the evening, Pavel and his wife exchanged glances. It was a brief and almost unnoticeable gesture. That very moment when people make a decision. And they said yes. Investigators later agreed that initially Smagin and Markov's plan might originally have involved fraud. To take possession of the property, make the deal, and disappear. But such schemes have a weak link. The victims themselves, plus the neighbors who recognized Smagin on sight. For some reason, Smagin didn't really want to leave his own home and go on the run. For some reason, he didn't want to go to prison either. His whole life was ahead of him, including his personal life, and wasting his youth in jail would be kind of stupid. The Latartsev family has no one in the city. The thought came up again. No one would even notice if they just disappeared one morning. And with a new understanding of this fact, the plan changed. The apartment stopped being real estate. It became a problem with 5 variables. Which had one logical solution if you think like a predator. The variables must disappear. After that, things moved quickly. The documents were prepared. The apartment was re-registered to a straw owner. Formally, the family no longer owned their apartment, and the Latartsevis were ready to vacate it. There was one last step left, the settlement. The transfer of money, after which the parties would go their separate ways, never to meet again. Pavel hinted to Smagin that they needed the money as soon as possible, and he swore that an acquaintance would bring the whole amount, literally in a few days. But the truth was, no one was planning to hand over the money. Neither Markov nor Smagin nor, of course, the front man had the money. Realizing they couldn't stall any longer, the friends decided to act as they had already planned in advance. By that time, they had already obtained the weapon for the crime, a pistol. Getting it and the bullets back then was as easy as pie. The question of the family's future was settled, but it was done easily and without regret. In the Alatartsev family, besides the 2 adults, there were 3 small children, a girl and 2 boys. Smagin met the girl in the stairwell very often, and she would smile at Uncle Seryoja and take candy from him. He had surely seen the younger children too when he visited Pavel. His heart should have trembled at the thought that the children would have to share the fate of their parents. It should have. But a witness is a witness, regardless of age. The logic of the crime left no room for hesitation. Smagin and Markov planned the crime calmly, without emotion, without hesitation, as if they were discussing a way to solve a technical problem. First, the husband was supposed to take the bullet. The strongest one had to be eliminated so he wouldn't have time to jump into a fight. Then the wife. If a woman starts a fight, you'll have endless problems, so you have to act quickly here too. And then they'll deal with the children, and that will be easy. Smagin had cleared out the trunk of his car in advance and prepared ropes and a blanket. They planned to take the bodies out that same day. The criminals weren't too worried that someone might hear the sounds of gunshots. First of all, the apartment doors were thick and sounds didn't get outside. Secondly, they planned to come during the day, which meant many people would be at work. Thirdly, in the 90s, apartment buildings heard all sorts of things. Neighbors got used to not opening the door, not looking through the peephole, not getting involved. The common sense of those years boiled down to one rule. If you hear something strange, pretend you didn't hear it. Smagin and Markov understood that there was a real chance to get away with it. They just needed to act quickly. There's no need to break in. Smagin is already a familiar, trusted face in this building. They'll open the door for him. They'll let him in. He'll be able to go inside and close the door behind him. And everything that happens next will stay inside the concrete box on one of the floors. That's exactly what happened. On June 21, 1994, Sergei Smagin knocked on the door of his neighbor's apartment. Markov was standing behind him, ready. His hand was gripping a pistol. When Pavel opened the door, the familiar smile that all the Alatartsev family knew appeared on Smagin's face. The same one he wore when offering help or giving candy to the children. "Hey, Pash, so? Time to settle up, comrade. Did you bring the money?" he began cheerfully. Pavel immediately stepped aside, letting him in. At the sound of his voice and the word money, his wife peeked out of the room. Somewhere in the living room, children were playing. Their presence was felt by the muffled noise, by the movement, by the life that at that moment was still ordinary. Smagin entered first. Markov followed. The door closed behind them. The click of the lock was quiet. Perhaps no one even noticed it, but at that very moment the apartment stopped being just an apartment. It became a trap for those it was supposed to be a fortress for, a place cut off from the stairwell, from the neighbors, from the city, a crime scene. There were cups with unfinished tea on the kitchen table. Children's toys were lying on the floor. Clothes were hanging on the coat rack. Ordinary things that, in a few minutes, would become witnesses to something that should never have happened. Trust opened the door. The rest was a matter of time. At the time of the crime, neither Smagin nor Markov knew that Pavel's wife was pregnant with their 4th child. That's why Pavel was in such a hurry to sell and wanted to move closer to his relatives before his wife gave birth. However, it's hard to imagine that this could have changed anything. The criminal's plan did not allow for any exceptions. The hosts led the guests to the kitchen. It's much more comfortable at the table, and you can have some tea while you talk. As soon as Pavel turned away, Smagin raised his hand with the pistol and aimed it at the man's head. Everything happened so quickly that Pavel didn't have a second to realize what was going on. A shot rang out, and he fell face first onto the kitchen table without even crying out, not even having time to understand what had happened. The sound was sharp but brief, like a pop. Blood splattered onto the walls and the light-colored kitchen cabinets. Pavel's wife froze in place with a towel in her hand. Horror doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it's paralysis, the inability to believe what's happening. That's the classic fight, flight, or freeze. She looked at the hand holding the gun, which was already rising toward her face, and simply accepted her fate without a fight. Worried children's voices came from the room. The youngest started whimpering in the crib. The second shot ended the mother's life before she could even beg for mercy, at least for her children. The bullet hit its mark. The woman fell next to her husband, and a dark pool of blood formed under her head almost immediately. And then, finally, there was an uproar. There were cries and frightened children's screams. For all three orphan children, the world still consisted of simple things: mom, dad, home. They didn't understand that everything had already changed irreversibly, but they did understand that something terrible had happened. Smagin and Markov acted quickly. These children could no longer escape, and there was really nowhere to hide in the apartment. Grabbing the older children by the hands, the criminals dragged them into the bathroom. It was cramped in there, with a slight smell of dampness and toothpaste, ordinary, boring smells familiar to anyone. They put the stopper in the tub and turned on the faucet. The water pressure was good, and the tub filled up quickly. Both children were crying, calling for their parents, and trying to break free. All this time, a gun was pointed at them, not so much as a threat, but more as a reminder of what was really happening. The water was still rushing when Smagin dragged the girl to the bathtub. Effortlessly lifting her off the ground, he suddenly plunged her head into the water. It was a movement without hesitation, businesslike, almost mechanical. The small body twitched. The girl desperately fought for her life, but against an adult man she didn't stand a chance. The boy could only helplessly watch as his sister died. Markov held him tightly. The criminal knew that next it would be his turn to take a life. When the girl quieted down, Markov dealt with the boy. It happened faster. Then they took the third one out of the crib. He met the same fate. Drowning takes much longer than a gunshot. By holding their victims' heads underwater, the criminals could literally feel every moment of agonizing torment, every drop of fading life. They could have stopped, but they didn't. Soon, the bathroom became quiet, and the only sound left was the water running from the tap. All three children were no longer moving, and although they pitied the bodies, the criminals left them there for now, in the bathroom, stacked on top of each other. After that, they returned to the hallway. The apartment was filled with the heavy smell of gunpowder and blood. Just to be sure, the criminals checked if the adults were really dead. As it turned out, they were. Later, the neighbors would say that they hadn't heard anything. No gunshots, no screams, no sounds of struggle, nothing.
I hadn't heard about that. How many years has it been? 30 already, right? I didn't even know it's been 30 years. I knew that they were supposed to sell their apartments and go to his mother, to Pasha's mother, either to Siberia or to the Urals.
The stairwell was the same as always, with the smell of dust and tobacco smoke, someone's footsteps on the stairs, and the sound of a toilet flushing. At the time of the crime, Sergei Smagin was only 25 years old. His accomplice, Valery Markov, was 26. In some sources, it's the other way around. The criminals went out for ropes and blankets. They acted quickly, but without rushing. Fortunately, it was the first floor, so they didn't have to go upstairs. Pavel and his wife were wrapped in a blanket, their heads covered tightly with cloth and tied up so that blood wouldn't accidentally stain the stairs. The children were carried out in blankets. They carried the bodies out carefully, listening to every sound. But that day it was unusually quiet. No one came out to the landing for a smoke. No one suddenly decided to take out the trash. Luck was on the criminals' side here as well. The air from the street carried summer scents. Somewhere nearby on a playground, children were laughing loudly. Smagin drove the car right up to the exit, and they loaded the bodies into the trunk without any problems. From the outside, it could have looked like a regular move, like people taking out old things, unnecessary junk. Of course, Smagin would have been recognized, but maybe he was just helping the Alatartsevs, whom he gets along with so well. If someone got interested, he would have found something to say. Smagin and Markov also chose the place to get rid of the main evidence in advance. Outside the city, in the area of Patrokol Bay, it was always empty, the wind was blowing. It was a place where you could work with a shovel and not have to look over your shoulder every second. A place that knows how to keep quiet and hold secrets. We worked quickly and methodically. The ground didn't give in right away, but it didn't really resist either. After all, we were young, strong men, still riding the wave of adrenaline. The criminals took turns, digging tirelessly. The thought kept pounding in their heads. Hurry, hurry, get rid of it and leave. They were lucky again. That day, no one passed by the two men who were diligently digging a strange pit. There were no cars, no random cyclists, no fishermen. Only the wind and the sound of a shovel going into the ground. One by one, the bodies disappeared under a layer of soil. First the adults, then the children. Neither Smagin nor Markov let their gaze linger on the faces. Faces were unnecessary. That's something that can stay in your memory, torment you with guilt. They needed to finish and leave. When the ground was leveled, the place looked almost the same as before. Almost. The tire tracks would soon be erased by wind and rain. Both criminals straightened up and sighed. The job was done. They threw the pistol into the Golden Horn Bay. The water accepted the metal without protest, and the sea swallowed the weapon instantly. All that was left was to get rid of the apartment, and then they could breathe easy. For now, Smagin and Markov returned to the scene of the crime and carefully washed the floor, and scrubbed the stains from the kitchen cabinetry. They waited a few days, just in case. No noise, no police checks at the entrance, and no one saw the Latartsevs anymore, but nobody cared. The neighbors knew they were planning to move, that they were selling the apartment, so no one paid attention to the unusual silence behind the door. A city filled with anxiety and the constant din of crime taught people to be indifferent to other people's lives. The relatives weren't worried yet either. They all lived in other cities, each with their own concerns, their own jobs, their own families. No one expected that the silence could be connected to a tragedy. The apartment needed to be sold quickly, and any lead that could point to one of the criminals had to be cut off. It was decided to exchange the apartment for a new Toyota car. The car looked cool and the engine purred. Both Smagin and Markov agreed that the car was worth the money. But here, luck seemed to abandon them for the first time. On the way to Novosibirsk, this Toyota got into an accident. There were no casualties, but the body was dented, the windows cracked, and the repairs would have required time and money that the criminals didn't have. As a result, after selling the car, they got only $300. $300 for 5 human lives. After that, the criminals went their separate ways. Smagin eventually moved to Volgograd. Markov started a family and settled in Zheleznogorsk, Krasnoyarsk Krai. He worked at a factory and was known as a quiet, calm person who was easy to get along with. For 30 years they hardly communicated at all. Their friendship ended when they split the money they got from selling the car between the two of them. It was Pavel's mother who raised the alarm about the missing family. The woman lived in another city and would occasionally call her son to catch up on the news. And suddenly, Pavel disappeared without a trace. The home phone was silent and there were no letters. The woman didn't know any of Pavel's acquaintances in Vladivostok. After several months of tense silence, she decided to go and visit her son in person. But when she rang the doorbell of the familiar apartment, strangers opened the door. "Who are you looking for?" came a polite question. "The Alatartsev family." "We don't know them, they don't live here." And then the woman realized that something had happened. The saying, "no body, no case," didn't just appear in Russian criminal culture for no reason. It reflects a harsh reality. It's almost impossible to prove a killing without a body, and such cases often go unnoticed or are simply swept under the rug. It seemed that in the case of the Alatartsev family, this saying would work perfectly. The bodies disappeared under a layer of earth near Patracal Bay. There were no suspects, no traces left in the apartment. The apartment itself had been officially re-registered. All the documents were in perfect order. The disappearance looked almost natural, as if they had simply moved somewhere else. Yes, without warning, yes, without telling their relatives, but you never know. That's just how the circumstances turned out, but Pavel's mother couldn't believe this version. She knew her son, his family, his habits, their plans for the future. And every day since she knocked on that, now someone else's door, her anxiety grew. She went to the police, tried to make contact, asked them to check with relatives and friends. A criminal case was eventually opened. The investigation into the disappearance of the Alatartsev family was conducted with no obvious leads. In the classic scenario of a crime investigation, the investigators have a starting point. Someone saw suspicious people near the victim, heard threats or complaints. Someone noticed a person with bloodied hands or a knife. This is called an obvious situation, a situation where there are direct indicators of the event and its participants. But in the case of the Alatartsev family, the investigators had none of this. It was unknown whether a crime had even taken place at all, or maybe they really did leave and just didn't tell anyone. The method of committing the crime was unknown. If their lives were taken, then how? There was no actual crime scene. No bodies were found. There were no signs of a struggle in the apartment, and no traces of blood either. There was no suspect. The Alatartsevs got along well with Magina. The relationship was trusting, and no one had seen Markov or the straw buyer. There was no clear motive. If they really were dealt with, then why? Revenge? A domestic quarrel? Other reasons? The investigators literally had to work blindly. They analyzed all the registration transactions involving the missing family's property and gradually identified the circle of beneficiaries, meaning those who stood to gain from the disappearance of the Alatartsev family. Sergei Smagin was not among them. Usually old cases are reopened using new methods. New forensic tests become available, DNA databases are created, and forensic experts start using technologies that didn't exist before. In the case of the Alatarkev family, there were no sensational breakthroughs. It was the methodical work of the investigator, stretching over years, checking every clue and hint, every conversation and glance, that did the job, while time relentlessly moves forward and erases all this from people's memory. It was in this painstaking work that the first real lead was found. One of the witnesses, questioned years later, remembered how in 1994 his acquaintance boasted that he once killed someone over an apartment. At the time he didn't believe it, laughed nervously and changed the subject. Who would ever admit to something like that? Who would brag about a crime? But decades later, the witness eventually reported it to the police. His words were the only thing they could hold on to. A thin thread they could pull on. Investigators began a new inquiry, and the information led them to Smagin, who was living in Volgograd at the time. He was no longer young. In 2024 he turned 55. The criminal was detained on the street on March 19th, 2024, and he confessed to everything almost immediately. Exactly 30 years had passed, but despite the years and possible attempts to forget, the memory of that June day remained clear in every detail. Smagin remembered every step, every movement. He remembered how he held the pistol, how he aimed and shot at Pavel, how his body fell face down onto the table. He remembered how he drowned the children one by one, how the water gurgled in the bathtub, how one child cried loudly while he was taking the life of another. "Did you act alone?" the investigators asked. Smagin shook his head. "Who was the other one? Tell us." The criminal shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know where he is now. We haven't talked since then. I don't really know much about him at all. We served in the army, and that's where he got the nickname Heck, and Heck was found soon after." On April 4th, Valery Markov was also detained in Zheleznogorsk. He didn't try to hide either and gave a full confession about the crime. He described every step and every detail. Markov's arrest caused a real sensation in the city. The 56-year-old man was raising 3 children, 2 of whom were under 18, and he worked at a mining and chemical plant in a managerial position. Neighbors, acquaintances, and colleagues considered him a decent person, incapable of cruelty. As it turned out, a real monster was living next to them. At the same time, the investigative committee of Primorsky Krai published photographs of Magina and Markov from 30 years ago. The official statement said, if you have any information about the relatives of the Alatartsev family or other victims of the people shown in the photographs, please call the number provided. If you want even more videos, visit Boosty if you're in Russia and Patreon if you're not in Russia. There you'll find exclusive videos that aren't on YouTube. The links are below the video. And Smagin, Magina, and Markov claimed that they only slipped up once. During the investigation and up until the case was handed over to the court, no information about new victims appeared. Both men were shocked when they found out that Pavel Alatartsev's wife was pregnant with their 4th child at the time of her death. The crime, already shocking in its cynicism and cruelty, became even more monstrous. Vladivostok was in turmoil. People were demanding severe punishment. Almost everyone wanted a life sentence. Discussions on social media, newspapers, and TV shows all indicated that the city wanted revenge. The deceased Alatarchev couple's relatives were recognized as victims in the case, Pavel's mother and brother, as well as his wife's sister. They also filed civil claims, seeking compensation for emotional distress. In general, Smagin and Markov are not people who live by violence from the start. They are people who gradually come to it. They simply don't have any inner restraint. Not in the sense that they wanted to take lives since childhood, but in the sense that they had no firm boundaries they wouldn't cross. Many people have such a boundary. Even if it's profitable, even if it's safe, it's still not allowed. But here it didn't exist. At first they entertained the thought, what if? Then calculation kicked in. And then this thought isn't rejected, but starts to be processed, discussed, clarified, and there's no internal mechanism to say stop. On the contrary, thinking kicks in and starts to optimize. It becomes a task. There's a goal to obtain a resource. There are obstacles, living people, and then they start recalculating. How to remove obstacles with minimal risks. And at this moment, a person stops perceiving others as subjects. They become variables, objects, factors that need to be taken into account. Then group dynamics kick in. Alone, one person might hesitate, but together, it's the opposite. They reinforce each other. Doubt doesn't develop, it gets suppressed. Each person sees that the other is also ready, and that normalizes the process. It's a typical mechanism. Responsibility seems to be shared. And that makes it easier to move forward. We decided is always psychologically easier than I decided. One of them, judging by his behavior, shows more initiative. He is the first to see an opportunity, the first to start building contact, to gain trust. This person has well-developed social intelligence, but no moral anchor. He knows how to be likable, how to inspire trust, and he uses it as a tool. And who exactly is this person in the pair? Guess in the comments. This person is not impulsive, not flashy, but quiet. The second one is more of a doer, but not passive. He doesn't hesitate, he gets involved quickly. It's important to him that there's already a plan. He doesn't create, he implements. But even in this type of person, there is often a dangerous trait. He can act even more harshly because he has less internal conflict. He doesn't experience it as his own decision. He experiences it as something that just needs to be done. And when the plan reaches the point where action is needed, they no longer have an emotional reaction. And not because they are psychopaths in the clinical sense, but because everything has already been decided in advance. The action itself is just carrying it out. That's why everything happens without chaos, hysteria, or confusion. They don't go into a state of agitation, they just work. And that's the key difference from many crimes. There's no outburst here, just a step-by-step process. It's like solving a problem, only with people. And another detail is the ability to return to normal afterward. After everything, they go on living calmly. For a whole 30 years they build a life, have children, work. Overall, things aren't bad for them, they socialize. And it's not necessarily, and most likely not, hypocrisy. It's the mind's ability to isolate events, to put it in a separate compartment, that was back then, without constantly reliving or rehashing it. It doesn't mean they don't have memories. On the contrary, they do, but those memories don't cause destruction. It's a very specific adaptation. A person sort of divides themselves into before and after, and doesn't let those parts overlap. And in that sense, they're more dangerous than they seem. Because these aren't people with a different mindset. They're not strange or abnormal. They're people who lost an inner prohibition, and after that, everything else just fell into place on its own. That's how I think this mechanism works. When two people who were normal before and after end up doing something terrible, and then they go on living peacefully for 30 years, and they would have kept living calmly and respectably if they hadn't been caught. But on April 17, 2025, the Frunzensky District Court of Vladivostok sentenced Sergei Smagin to 14 years and 11 months in a strict regime penal colony, and Valery Markov to 14 years and 8 months in a strict regime penal colony. No appeal followed. The sentence became final. The city was shocked. For almost 3 decades, the criminals had successfully evaded responsibility for the gruesome crime, and the judges gave them only 15 years each. The prosecutor's office was forced to issue an official explanation. Law enforcement representatives explained that the sentence was handed down based on the law that was in effect at the time the crime was committed. That is, the court found Smagin and Markov guilty under points E, Z, and N. Article 102 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. Intentional deprivation of life of 2 or more persons, a woman known to be pregnant, by prior agreement by a group of persons, with the aim of facilitating and concealing another crime. In the 90s, the laws on such serious crimes had a maximum prison sentence limit of 15 years. There simply was no harsher punishment within the legal system that existed at that time. This explanation only partially reassured people. For most city residents, the number 15 seemed offensive, incompatible with the scale of the crime. No legal technicalities could balance the sense of loss and outrage, but the law remained the law, and the verdict stood. Pavel's mother, relatives, neighbors, and the whole city had to come to terms with it. Their only consolation is the thought that both Smagin and Markov will most likely end their days behind bars, despite the lenient sentences. Prison life is no picnic, and both criminals are no longer young men. One way or another, justice finally caught up with those who took the lives of innocent people, even if it happened after 30 long years. And what do you think about this case? Write in the comments, leave likes or dislikes. I'll leave additional materials in the Telegram channel Strashnoti. Subscribe and watch other videos on the channel. They come out even if you don't always get notifications about them.